frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and there's one thing I want to know: what's so funny about peace, love, and hacky-sacking? I'm joined once again on this episode by Sasha Wood. Sasha is the host of the YouTube channel Casually Comics, where she talks about comic books and comic storylines new and old. Sasha, welcome back to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be back. I'm excited to talk about Star Trek Insurrection.
Yeah, me too. It's great to have you back. Today we will be talking about the next generation film, Star Trek Insurrection. With the critical and financial success of First Contact, the crew of the Enterprise E had distinguished themselves as worthy heirs to the Trek film legacy. But in Hollywood, every franchise is only as good as its last success, meaning Picard and crew's latest mission would be fielding an adventure that could surpass their last effort. To accomplish that, Paramount turned to Michael Piller, the co-creator of Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and one of the chief architects of Trek's success in the 90s and 2000s. Piller understood the TNG crew and character of Picard better than perhaps any other writer, and he understood as well that it would be difficult to top First Contact's action-packed thrills. His solution to this challenge was to present a more contemplative story, one that was a look inward for both the crew of the Enterprise and for the Federation itself, an exploration of the responsibilities of those in power and the lengths that the powerful will go to when their authority is threatened, a film with a message about maintaining your perspective, no matter how distant home may be. It also has a purple space bazooka, so there's that. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, it is great to have you back on the show, Sasha. And your YouTube channel, Casually Comics, covers comics and comic topics, both classic and modern. And you have a lot of videos, several new videos each week. How do you maintain such a prolific schedule?
I think it's just because I enjoy it so much.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, I'm always coming up with new ideas and new things that I want to talk about. Sometimes so fast that I don't get a chance to talk about them all. In fact, frequently, that's what happens.
Oh, really?
But
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just like, if anybody who knows producing audio or producing video, there's shooting, obviously, and editing, but there's writing, and there's all these elements that sort of go into it, and there's all these hours that you don't see. And so I could imagine you writing a script or having an idea and being like, maybe I'm just not going to, I'll put that one in the hopper and we'll get to it later.
Oh, there are so many videos that have been filmed but not edited, and they just don't see the light of day, and they just sit there, and they probably never will, but that's okay.
Okay. All right. Yeah, there's an endless number of comics and comic characters and stories, stretching back over 80 years in some cases. So how do you decide what to make videos about at the time that you make them?
It's pretty much just whatever I'm interested in. Yes, there is a slight the kind of focus on what is trending out there, but it's mostly what I think will make an interesting thing to discuss. And sometimes other people agree and sometimes they don't.
Have you seen the numbers on this latest video? Whoops, people didn't like that. How much do you let that influence you as a creator? I mean, I know that you said that it's about your creative whims, but do you see sometimes like, man, why don't they? I'm going to do another video on this. People are going to get this, I swear.
Honestly, it doesn't bother me. Like, if it's too low, then I'm like, okay, well, it's time to pivot. Like, obviously, like, I need to pay attention to what people are enjoying or what they're not enjoying. But sometimes just, maybe I didn't have the best Tyler thumbnail. Maybe I didn't pick the best, tactic. Like, title and thumbnail plays a lot into it.
Yes. The tortures of having to produce on YouTube. It's like, what do they want? Yeah. Well, you can't go wrong with Marvel and DC content, and their films have dominated the box office in recent years. But both franchises are reaching, let's say, points of uncertainty currently, with Marvel looking for new directions post-Endgame and DC looking for direction, period. Yeah. How do you think that the big two are going to continue to capture audiences at the multiplex?
I kind of hope they don't, which might be an odd thing to say as someone who enjoys comic book content. I would enjoy if the other genres also got a chance to proliferate and have some space. There's been lots of exciting work happening in the indie space. It would be nice to see some of that maybe get a chance to rise up a bit, because there's been a bit of a glut of this one specific genre for a while. And as much as I personally enjoy it, I think you can see the formula starting to really override the creativity in a lot of parts.
Yeah.
And that's usually a good sign that it's time to take a break.
Yeah, you see, Hollywood has always responded to trends, and you see it both in superhero and comic stuff and in non-comic stuff where, Marvel and DC produces movies or shows that are characters that are, different than your Captain Americas or your Supermans, but they sort of make the characters fit that kind of superhero thing that we expect.
Yeah.
Or you'll even see non-superhero stuff like I'm really looking forward to the new Rings of Power show, but they're really like making it look like bombastic, action superhero kind of thing. And I'm sure that's influenced by what's going on in the movies.
It definitely is. And I find that played out, especially with lots of the later, more modern Trek films, whereas we need more action here.
Yeah. I think that they're doing some things to try to change things up or meet the demands of providing variety and sort of a new thing. I was interested to read recently that the plan for the future Avengers films would be for them to kind of cap off whatever storytelling phase that they're coming at the end of. They're kind of like when you have a crossover, like in comics, like the main crossover book for what's going on in the other titles.
Yeah.
And it's a storytelling model that comics have used for generations. And it's interesting to see both that and also just comic storytelling models being employed now in cinema. Going to, people joke that the Marvel films are 23, 24 episodes of a TV show or issues in a comic series. And I think that that's interesting.
It's a big investment, though. Like, you're asking a lot from the audience, because most people, I find, tend not to enter that level of fandom where you're getting involved with wanting to see absolutely everything. So when you create an entire franchise that kind of starts to hinge on needing to see everything, it definitely impacts it. Like, I noticed that when I was rewatching Insurrection, because I hadn't seen it since I was younger. And so I hadn't watched Deep Space Nine at that time. And so I had included into how much the Dominion War and stuff was factoring into everything. And I was like, wow, a lot of this makes a lot more sense now that I have all this context for the Dominion War and like the threats against the Quadrant and all of that. So I'm like, yeah, this would have been good information to have at the time.
Yeah. And I was, totally submersed in that, when there was two first run Star Trek shows on TV and reruns. And so we always knew, oh, that's so-and-so, or they mentioned the one thing. And of course, the joke is that we were nerds back then. Now everybody's a nerd because they're like, no, Captain America and Bucky, met at this point and they did this. And even regular fans are comic fans now. I just hope that as they mine more comic content, especially on the Marvel side, they use some discretion in picking their crossovers. Don't just go to whatever. Sure, you pulled off Infinity War, good job. But let's skip Atlantis Attacks. Let's not do the Clone Saga. Don't go back to Contest of Champions. We don't need to do that sort of thing.
You mean you don't want Heroes Reborn from the 90s?
Oh my God. They're going to get there. When they reboot, they'll draw from that, I'm sure. Then there's the DC and Warner Brothers side, who's going through some very public troubles right now with their merger and cancellation of movies like Batgirl, canceling the Bruce Timm animated series.
Oh, they're just canceling everything. That's my thing. When people are like, I can't believe that. I'm like, he canceled everything.
Oh, absolutely. Although they did kind of de facto greenlight Batman 2 because they gave Matt Reeves a new deal. And so presumably he'll want to make Batman 2. But
well, that one did so well. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it did do really well. It didn't do quite as well as I think Batman versus Superman or even The Dark Knight Rises, but I think it was, critically very successful. And that's the funny thing is that movie isn't really, everything's sort of in flux with DC, but it's not really in their main continuity. And I think a lot of their biggest successes have been movies like Joker, like the Batman, that are outside of the main DCEU, when they seem to want to create a universe like the MCU, but they've had great success with these standalone films. Aquaman has nothing really to do with the rest of the DC films when you think about it, but it made $1 billion. So yeah. Well, Marvel and DC make up the lion's share of what's on the stands, and what you cover on the show reflects that. But what are some of the videos that you've made about non-Marvel or DC characters?
Well, actually, just today, I dropped a Witchblade video, which is always very exciting for me because it's one of the first comics that I read. So
yeah.
I very rarely indulge in some of the random things that I'm reading, but it is nice to visit them every now and again because I do read a lot of older things like that. I read a lot of indie series. I read a lot of graphic novels. So it's nice to be able to spotlight them every now and again.
Yeah. I was really excited to see, well, I mean, like, I wasn't really excited about the character, but when, like, Bloodshot came out, I thought, oh, okay, maybe this Vin Diesel will help this get off the ground. We'll get, some competing, like, Valiant films. And, of course, Bloodshot came out at a very tough time, right before the pandemic started. But, yeah,
I mean, it's also not great, so...
Well, it's not great, but but neither are the car movies, and yet those are fun, and people like them, so... Yeah, that didn't turn out quite so well. That's interesting. Like, I was never a huge Witchblade fan, although I was an Image dude back in the day. Mm-hmm. And I'll have to watch that one. I haven't seen that one yet. The thing about Witchblade is that always caught me up was I was never like a huge Michael Turner fan. And also, whenever I picked up a issue of Witchblade, I never knew what was going on, and nothing, I don't want to say nothing happened, but nothing like earth-shattering happened in each issue. And that was a turnoff to me. But now I realize that's kind of how we tell like these long form stories, like with streaming TV. Every new show is like a chapter in this longer story. And so I think that they were ahead of their time as far as the storytelling goes, building this long narrative.
Witchblade actually lays a lot of seeds. It lays more seeds than people think. And it's a lot more introspective than people think, because there is so much cheesecake in it that tends to be what a lot of people focus on. But there's a lot more going on there than that. And I've always been a big fan of Turner's art. So I actually enjoy that aspect of it. So for me, it's a really fun series.
Sure. Well, you're a comics expert. You got this YouTube channel explaining comic storylines. So I thought maybe I could run some of my own personal comics questions by you. Mm-hmm. Here's a question. One of my favorite characters is John Jones, the Martian Manhunter.
Okay.
But something that I've always wondered about him, because he's so mysterious, can he become gaseous? I know that his body, sometimes he stretches, he can turn into other people, but like, what's going on with his body? Like, does he have organs, or is he just like a man-shaped block of stuff that can do anything?
His powers get pretty intense at times. He can definitely phase. So he can definitely phase through walls and objects and the like that. So I've never seen him become gaseous, but since he can shapeshift so intensely, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So they should do a thing where he dresses up like a vampire or something like that. Or is DC they're doing a vampire thing right now, so maybe that'll happen.
Yeah, DC versus vampires.
How about this? Will I ever be able to get back into the X-Men? And here's what I mean by that. We used to say that once Grant Morrison writes your favorite book, you'll never recognize it again. Now I feel like that's Jonathan Hickman, who is a writer that I really like and respect, but man, he takes comics to a weird place. And I haven't read the X-Men in a while. And from what I understand, he has completely changed what's going on in the X-Men. Like, you would barely even recognize it.
It's very, very different. Like, the Krakoan era is definitely miles away from any era that has happened before. The thing is that they've diverged at this point so far away from what he initially planned, because he's no longer there anymore. And they've even talked about how lots of the things he had planned, because it was initially supposed to be a 3-year arc, but they liked it so much that they've ended up stretching it out past that. So now we're in like Clone Wars kind of territory where things are being stretched past what they should be. And so now a lot of the original plot lines don't even make sense anymore. So they're like, we couldn't even go back to the things that he wanted to do if we wanted to.
Yeah. That kind of sounds like classic X-Men, though. There's a lot of plot lines that Chris Claremont would throw in. It's like, oh no, I was never going to do anything with that. So. Okay, what's your favorite non-Big Two book right now?
My favorite non-Big Two book? Honestly, I'm not reading too much current stuff. Like, I'm basically kind of catching up with a lot of things. I went through an omnibus buying spree like months ago, and I'm finally catching up on some of those things. Like, I've been reading 90s Starman. My Witchblade compendium just showed up the other day, so I finally have like the complete first 50 issues and things like that. So I'm just slowly chipping away at that. I did get the new Black Sad, so I'm excited for that. So
okay, yeah, nice. And one more question. Why don't we disband while we have the chance?
We really should.
Yeah. Well, when I got in touch with you and told you that we're talking about the films of Star Trek on the show this year, you said that you'd like to talk about Star Trek Insurrection. And I was happy, but I was honestly wondering if anyone was going to prefer that as a pick. Not because it's a bad film, though it's got its problems, but because I think that it's a forgotten film in a lot of ways.
It is a little memory hold. I've always loved it. It's one of my favorites of them. And when I rewatched it again, I loved it even more. Like so many of the themes that it's working through, I actually think applies so much more now, especially with the Baku and the way that they're rejecting technology. It's very Dune like, but Larry and Jihad. Like I really enjoyed it. I wish they'd actually explored some of the complications between them and the Sona a bit more. But I know the Sona being related to them was like a later script edition. So I know that they probably couldn't have gone into it as much, but there's so much really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting themes to work through there. And I find those themes are just as interesting as what they're working through with the Federation, which means you have a narrative that, yes, has a very clear, like, here's what's going on that's wrong, but it also takes the time to present a here's why it's happening, which I think does wonders for making it a more nuanced and balanced experience, which I really appreciate.
And I'm not sure, like, those are complicated themes. I think it makes, it distinguishes the film. But I'm not sure why it hasn't been remembered quite as well. I mean, certainly the franchise as a whole never really doubled down on the ideas that are in the film. Something that grinds my gears a little is like, I like it when Star Trek films or shows contribute to the overreaching story of the Federation. You know, we see little bits of the Federation and Starfleet. And the film has seemingly a lot of things to say about that. You know, Michael Piller, as a guy who wrote and set the direction for a lot of the middle part of the franchise. Yeah, I think he wanted this film to be another step in the evolution of that franchise, or at least have it be a test or a check-in with where the Federation is morally after the events of DS9 and Voyager.
Yeah.
And that continues into Nemesis with the Romulan political trouble. But then we get the reboot films, and even with the new series on Paramount Plus, you know, they've yet to return to the Federation as an evolving character outside of just name checking the values that it was founded to uphold. And I think it's a missed opportunity.
It's an interesting film in that regard, because I feel like it's constantly struggling with coming after First Contact. You can feel that it wants to be bigger than it is. And it's bogged down by a lot of things. And it's actually one of the critiques that people have against it, which is valid, but I don't think it's as big a deal as some people make it out to be, which is like a lot of the critiques were and still are that it feels like an extended episode.
Yes.
They say like, oh, this just feels like one big long episode. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And firstly, I think the production value definitely brings it up past like your standard, oh, it's just an episode.
Right.
But I think that it melds the action portions of Trek well with the themes of Trek, which is something that I really enjoy. Like First Contact is very lightning in a bottle. I don't think anything should try and be First Contact. Like let it be what it is, you know?
Yeah.
But I think for what Insurrection is and what it's trying to be, when you look into what it was trying to present and the type of atmosphere it was trying to put forward, I think it achieves what it's setting out for. It's not trying to be as big, because one of the things, well, I think this was a terrible idea, but one of the things they put forward is that, oh, this should be our voyage home. I'm just like, nothing should be voyage home, but you know what?
Right. Yeah.
But you know, I think this is way better than voyage home personally. And I do like the little elements of trying to bring the crew more in as family and the like, even though at points like some of the humor is pretty, when Trek does humor, it varies very hard.
Yes, it does.
Poor Worf, you know, he gets pulled back from DS9 to be the butt of puberty jokes for this movie.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a tough job, but some Klingon has to do it. Yeah. Would you say that this is your favorite Trek film?
No, it's not my favorite, but it's up there.
But it's your favorite TNG film?
It's like, for TNG, my favorite one is definitely First Contact, but I find this one more interesting.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And when people say it's like a long episode, it's like, well, you like Star Trek episodes, right? Like, what's the problem? Give it a $70 million budget. Yeah.
Well, when I was looking through some of the old reviews, because I was like, oh, why not? You know, just for fun, let's go back to some of the reviews from the day and see what people were saying. And I was like, these reviews are mean. They're so harsh. But one of the things I noticed was that they were saying that like, oh, this is so outdated and all these things. That sounded to me like what they were looking for was a different Star Trek. I feel like Insurrection is very true to what TNG is and also what DS9 and Voyager were at the time. But it almost feels like some people were looking for something different. and beyond that, because it has all the hallmarks. Even has a Picard speech in it, which I love.
Yeah. He talks a guy out of killing him, basically. Yeah. And I think that was very much on Pillar's mind when he wrote and developed the idea for the script. Like, he wanted to capture that. The film, of course, is very reminiscent of some particular TNG episodes, like Homeward, where they're literally transplanting a race, or Who Watches the Watchers. Or today I was thinking about Journey's End, and the storyline where Picard is trying to remove a small group of indigenous people from a planet, and they're sort of wrestling with their morality over that. So I think that all of those things were definitely intended, but yet, like you said, maybe it wasn't what people wanted. We just did a live show talking about Star Trek First Contact, and something that we did on the show was read reviews of First Contact, which were, positive for the most part. But I've noticed in reading a lot of reviews over the course of like this series that reviewers tend to say the same things about Star Trek films, whether it's good or bad. Yeah. And it's either it's got a breath of fresh air for a great franchise, or this is too much like an episode and they need to pick it up a little bit. And so we played a game where people had to guess what movie it was. And it was tough to do because people just critics, I think everybody expects something from Star Trek. We just all expect different things sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk later about people's reactions to the film, but let's talk about the technical details of the film really quick. This is, of course, the third of the TNG films, the ninth film total. It came out on December 11th of 1998. The screenplay was by Michael Piller, the story by Rick Berman and Michael Piller. It was directed by Jonathan Frakes and produced by Rick Berman. There is no stardate given for this film, but it ostensibly takes place during the 7th season of DS9 and the 5th season of Voyager, but it's probably vague for that reason because a lot was going on in the universe of Star Trek at that point. As far as Worf's involvement, it's a running joke that we don't know why Worf is here. He begins to tell us, and he is cut off by dialogue. But nobody says, sorry to hear about your wife's death. So I'm guessing that it's well into the 7th season of DS9. Fun fact, Michael Piller wanted to include a line acknowledging Jadzia's recent death, but Rick Berman nixed that line, and I have an unhappy face in my notes about that. The budget of the film was pretty high for a TNG film. It was $70 million compared to First Contact's $45 million. It made $70 million domestically and $117 worldwide. And as a point of comparison, First Contact made $146 million worldwide. Speaking of the money that it made, it is the third lowest grossing film domestically. Do you want to guess what the lowest film out of the 13 films is domestically?
Of all of them?
Yeah.
I mean, I want it to be Star Trek V, but it's probably not.
You're close. It's Star Trek Nemesis.
Ah.
Which, completely way down at the bottom. Star Trek V is second. Star Trek Insurrection's third. And Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, is fourth from the bottom, which is interesting. Yeah, I know.
That movie's great.
Yeah, it is. But those numbers are adjusted for inflation, so it's sort of diminishing returns. It's also the fifth lowest rated Trek film. Guess what's at the bottom?
Is it also Nemesis?
No, this time it was 5. So Star Trek V's at the bottom, followed by Nemesis, Generations at number 11, the motion picture at 10, although that might be in flux with the re-release of the remastered version this year. And then, of course, Insurrection is number 9 out of 13 films. We've talked a little bit about what people expect, but in reading some of those reviews, like what was behind the critics' poor reception to the film?
I think that because rewatching it, especially at the start, because it does take a while to build up to what it is getting to, which I appreciate, but it gives it a much slower feeling pace. And you spend a lot of time before you get into any space battles or anything like that. Yeah. And so I feel like for some people, it didn't feel very cinematic. And, and I think another thing that helps with that feeling is that while they did have a set built for the village and everything, weather didn't allow them to use it. So they had to reuse a lot of the DS9 and Voyager sets. Yeah. And you can see in certain portions, like, oh yeah, like that's the cave from all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I know that Patrick Stewart didn't even want to do the fleeing up to the mountains at the end. He wanted to do an Alamo style standoff in the village. And they were like, we do not have the budget for that. Yeah, no, you're going to the mountain.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's too bad. I think the Baku are an interesting idea. I know that I think they wanted to make them humans to make them relatable, but if they had been kind of like Alien or looked a little different, or not just worn those, like there's that long sequence at the beginning where I think they're really trying to sell us that maybe this is in the past or it's a different time period or something. There's a blacksmith and there's people like weaving, but there's a lot of synthetic fabrics in those shots, and all the clothes are so clean that you're sort of like, all right, what's happening here? I'm not really buying this. They just look like, speaking of episodes, like, a lot of times the Enterprise will go to a planet with people who don't have spaceships, and they're just wearing these, I've got the vest shirt combo, and that's kind of what it looks like.
Well, which I find very funny because they say in one of Pillar's memos that this is the sexiest Star Trek story.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, a sexy kissless romance,
yes.
Which we'll talk about as well. Let's talk about the development of the film. It had a very fast turnaround time, just like First Contact, less than 2 years. Talk about the film began in February of 97 after the success of First Contact. And Ronald Moore and Brandon Braga, who wrote the first two TNG films, were busy working on their respective shows, DS9 and Voyager. And they were also working on Mission Impossible 2. Yep, everybody remembers the motorcycles and the birds. Nobody remembers that was a Moore Braga joint. So keep that in the back of your mind. Rick Berman reached out to former TNG showrunner and co-creator of both DS9 and Voyager, Michael Piller. He had been approached to write First Contact initially, but he had learned that his treatment would be put up against the Moore Braga treatment in sort of a contest as to which one was best. And he said, no thanks. So it was just him on this one he was in. He had liked First Contact, but he had thought that it was too dark. So his aim was to make Insurrection a lighter film in tone. And he specifically referenced the Roddenberry box. This is that convention that many Trek writers have struggled with over the years. The idea that the future should be positive. Gene Roddenberry didn't want conflict or darkness in his Trek stories. And although it was something that Piller and the writers in his charge had struggled with, he believed that it was something that audiences had come to expect from the franchise. And I think that's a really interesting idea because I've heard that from the showrunner that preceded him, Maurice Hurley, as well. They're both experienced TV writers, and they both, like to buck trends and be creative. But ultimately, they both came down on the side of, no, we should do what Gene wants to do. And it wasn't until we got a show like DS9 where Gene was either not available or just gone that they're like, well, we're going to do what we want to do. And everybody remembers how great and revolutionary DS9 is. So I think it's interesting that Piller he's a creative guy, but he's maybe a guy who, as a showrunner, keeps things on the track. And for this movie, he was like, no, let's keep it on the track. Let's do something that resembles a TNG episode. And that's maybe why people think of it as an episode.
Well, the thing is that DS9 and them, they don't fully throw the box out, though, because TNG, especially.
Well, they're definitely outside the box.
They're outside of it, but they keep the most important element of the box present, which is aspiration and optimism. It's the idea that the future can be better, that we can be better, and that even though there are still problems, because the box goes too far, it's like there's no grief or no anything. But the thing is, you need the idea that humanity has overcome something, because that's core to Trek. As soon as you start getting into like, oh, we're just terrible, you've really veered off course of one of the core tenets, which is that we're evolving, going forward, finding new solutions, even if they are to old problems. And I think that that's something that Insurrection does very well, because it's bringing up some, things in history and now that still happen. And it's still trying to find a way to reconcile them, but still through the lens of the idea that there are good people and the Federation and Starfleet are a good concept. But like with anything, it can be corrupted based on, circumstance or need or personal gain or all of those other things.
Yeah. Wanting to live forever. No, wait, we can't. We can't hurt these people. They're too good at weaving. Rick Berman was really set on adapting a classic novel to Trek, and his first pick was he was inspired by the book and the film Prisoner of Zenda, which is about a man who resembles the king of a small European nation, and he gets mixed up in kind of a prince and pauper intrigue when the king is kidnapped. He wanted Picard to be the character who is kidnapped, and he's replaced with an imposter. And it's an idea that was recycled, of course, for the next film, Nemesis. He also proposed that Data's brother Lore could return as the antagonist, another idea that was kind of recycled for the next film with B4. So if you have an idea, don't throw it away. Hold on to it.
They'll use it for the next one.
Yeah. Piller's idea, it was a bit more personal. He tells this, he wrote a memoir called Fade In, The Making of Star Trek Insurrection that was published after his death about the process of developing the film. And he said that one day when he was applying his Rogaine, he got to thinking about the idea of youth culture and being obsessed with staying young, as a touchstone for a story. And it made me think, like, don't you think that people in Hollywood or people who have worked there are self-conscious about the image culture and plastic surgery? Like, I think of this movie, people getting their face stretched. I think of like Bruce Campbell's character in Escape from L.A. Or like Brazil, like the mother in Brazil having her... Yeah. So he was thinking about those kind of things. And Piller and Berman settled on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as an outline for the film, but Piller's subtitle for his treatment was Heart of Lightness.
Yes.
Which is like, okay, I can see where you're going, but I don't know where you're going to end up. That first treatment was titled Star Trek Stardust. And in it, the idea was Picard would be sent to track down someone he knew, a former Starfleet Academy classmate, who was attacking Romulan ships. And as the crew gets close to grabbing him, they begin to reverse age thanks to this briar patch radiation. Berman didn't like that. He was worried that Patrick Stewart would be offended with a storyline about being old and aging. So it's that self-conscious thing there. They did another draft where they replaced the character that Picard knew with Data. So Picard would have to hunt him down. But the Paramount executives didn't really like that one. They didn't like the Heart of Darkness, political colonialism sort of themes. Somebody else didn't like this draft, and that was associate producer Patrick Stewart, because he thought Picard should be involved in more action. He wanted movie Picard, and he thought that Picard should have a love interest. And so Berman,
because he loved how it turned out in First Contact. He said that he felt like Picard was now a movie hero.
Yeah.
And
Picard is dead.
He didn't want to move backwards. Speaking of wanting the romance, that's why he was so angry when they cut the kiss from the final draft. He was like, oh, more romance for the captain, like that original memo he sent all those years ago.
Yeah, he really wanted that kiss in there. But Berman eventually met with Stewart to talk out his problems. And I think he just sort of like last-ditch effort just pitched him the Fountain of Youth idea. And contrary to his concerns, Stewart loved the idea. He was all in. So they kept that, and they also kept the sort of fight with Data, but they relegated that to the first act of the film. This new draft got another bad review, this time from DS9 writer Ira Stephen Bear. He thought that the film's villains, who were then called the Sony, of course you got to fix that, they needed to be beefed up and be meaner, and that the Baku, who at that time in that draft were a race of children because of their de-aging, should be adults, mostly so Picard could have a romance with one of them. So they made those changes. Here's some other titles that they kicked around for the film. Sacred Honor, Rebellion, High Treason, Revolution, Beyond Paradise, and Nemesis. Always keep the ideas that you write down. A lot of elements were proposed, shot down. They snuck in the back door and ended up in the script anyway. So this final product is kind of a mishmash of all the initial ideas. And it's interesting because like that is, that's no weird occurrence for writing a movie script. But looking back through this year, like the development of all the Star Trek films, this is, I think, one of the most... the most obvious examples of them just going, give me the first half of that one and the second half of that one. Like we have to kind of get this made.
It's very cobbled together.
Yeah.
And right down to the wire at the ending, because they initially had a different ending.
It did. Yeah.
And then they end up changing it.
Yeah. We can talk about that. There were several scenes that didn't make it into the film. Armin Shimmerman actually filmed a scene as Quark where he arrives on the planet because he wants to open a resort because it's so nice. And he is taken away by Worf at the end of the film.
I can't say I'm sad that got cut.
Yeah, I could see. I understand the idea. I don't think it would have worked, though.
I was just going to say, I'm also glad the original ending was changed just because it had Rufo de-aging in space. And I just think about how horrifying that would look with the effects of the time.
I know. He gets shot into the rings and then he de-ages. Does he de-age into like a cell or something like that? He disappears for some reason.
Yeah, they do. Well, it's that kind of de-aging, where you just go, and then you stop being. So.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. I guguess, life begins or doesn't begin when you
just, Twilight Zone it. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There was also a scene where Troy and Riker are researching the Zona species, a longer version of the scene in the film that Max Grodenchik, Rom actor Max Grodenchik is in. So they were definitely still in flux about what they
Mm-hmm.
wanted the film to be like. They cut the kiss scene, which you had mentioned before, the kiss between Picard
I'm
and
not as
Anish.
angry about that as Patrick Stewart was. I
It's yeah,
personally, I think the relationship was still clearly romantic. Like, even without having to have like an on-screen kiss, it was quite clear based on the context and everything going on that
sure,
it was a romantic relationship. So
yeah.
I don't know if it necessarily
It's
needed that big giant Hollywood kiss at the end to confirm, like, yes, these two people really like each other.
yeah. It's I think that it's a pardon the phrase, a mature relationship, and I think that comes
Mm-hmm.
across. But he kisses Lily like on the cheek in the last movie, so something maybe. Apparently, they had shot it, and what they had wanted to do was apply the Baku slow motion effect to it.
Oh, okay.
But once they saw it and in post production, they're like, oh, this doesn't work. So they just they cut it, and $70 million down the drain. They're not going to reshoot that at this point. Also, Picard has an arguably different arc in the original script. They, or at least a longer arc. They had
Hmm.
cut scenes that emphasized the idea that Picard had become frustrated by the duties of a flagship captain. There's a scene where he's like eating lunch and he spills it on his uniform. He's trying to research the Baku, and he's frazzled. He has a lot of work to do. And I think the big pile of pads that we see in his quarters in the finished
Mm-hmm.
film is like a remnant of that idea.
Mm-hmm. Again, that's another thing I'm kind of glad they dialed back on, because that would put it way more into Wrath of Khan territory, which I
Yeah.
feel already deals with those themes very well. Because in this one, you end up more with that wistful sense of wish fulfillment without
Yeah.
ever like fully focusing on like, oh man, like youth specifically, but just on that kind of light idea of what, like, could you go back, heart of lightness. So
Heart of lightness. Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned before that one thing that Pillar and the producers wanted was like funny. They wanted to sort of
yes.
replicate the success of Star Trek 4. But I do agree that there's a lot of Star Trek 2 in this as
Mm-hmm.
well. Just the idea of renewal, the idea of it's like there's a joke that like every Star Trek movie is about the characters like feeling old, right? Except for 2009 and Into Darkness, and then Beyond comes around and they're old, right? And so it's kind of that, but I think they were sort of self-consciously aware of that. And so it's less about how we're old and more about how we've kind of lost the perspective of why we do this, not only searching the universe, but searching ourselves as well.
Mm-hmm.
Living our best lives, and if we're doing that instead of running around and wearing bead hats and eating flowers or whatever. Here's some other bits of trivia. This is the first of only 2 Star Trek films to not have any scenes on Earth. The other was Star Trek Beyond. This is the only Trek movie without a star date, and along with Into Darkness, it's the only film with no captain's log. This is the last Star Trek film to have the cast and crew credits at the start of the movie instead of the end, which is now customary. And boy, Marvel movies have really taken a run with that, just putting all the names at the end. And this is the shortest of all 13 Star Trek movies at 103 minutes. The second shortest is Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, at 105 minutes. And I think it would be very hard to convince somebody that if they didn't like this, more of this is what they need. But I do think that taking some of the themes and some of the emotions in the film for more of a walk might have worked. Some of my favorite scenes. And this is a movie that is trying to blend comedy and action, is 103
Mm-hmm.
minutes long. Some of my favorite scenes are where they kind of go over what's already going on. Like the
Mm-hmm.
scene where Rufo is trying to convince Dougherty, about they can't let, the Enterprise plead this cause. And we all understand the stakes. We know why Riker is trying
That's
to
a
get out of the
great
briar
scene.
patch. But him going through the entire thing all over again and then saying, like, maybe he doesn't want to come back and send just ships. Like, that's a great scene that if this was too long, you would cut that scene. And I'm glad it's there.
I definitely would have loved to see more of the Sona, because I think there was so much more to do with them, especially after their connection is revealed.
Yeah.
I would have loved to dive more into, because the Baku are kind of falling into that like perfection kind of stereotype
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
of the times.
Yeah.
But so the movie never addresses the fact that they exiled these people. And
Yeah.
that's something that they need to work through, because even though, yes, they're coming back and now they're trying to destroy them, and that's not right, they need to work through where Ruofo's anger comes from. because it's been twisted and warped, but it comes from a genuine place of being kicked off of this planet for having a different view of life. Because basically the Baku were like extreme mindfulness, just constant mindfulness, like living in the now. She talks about, like, Anij talks about how, oh, you know, you don't need to think about tomorrow or the past. And like, you can imagine that the young people, especially those who were always there, might not necessarily agree with that mindset. So to be kicked out for wanting to explore something that you never got a chance to even look into, and then to suffer all these horrible, debilitating physical effects by trying to maintain the benefits that they got from the planet that have turned them, like, their genetics are toxic. I just think it could have been so interesting to dive more into that.
Do you think that there is then an overreaching theme or suggestion by the film that, like, you know, that supports traditionalism? Like, they should have just stayed on the planet. It was a bad idea for them to want to see the universe, because that's kind of in conflict with the main theme of the entire franchise, which is like seeking out new lives and new worlds, new civilizations.
I think it ends up putting it there by accident, because it never fully explores because what they're doing isn't actually necessarily traditionalism when you get into where they've come from and why they've left behind what they've left, which is they've already experienced destroying their planet through technology. So now they've come back, and really some of what they're doing, which isn't addressed, it isn't just the youth and the beauty of the planet and the mindfulness and the ability to slow down a perfect moment, which is pretty cool. But it's also, there's that fear. There's that fear that's never fully explored, that if they let these people, you know, have access to this technology, that might happen again. And I think that would have been very interesting, because I do also like the idea of having this group of people who on the surface, based on the whole, like, oh, look at their peasant fair and all of that stuff, you would assume don't know anything about technology. So I do like that they flip that on its head, and they totally know about, but they've rejected it. But I think it would be more interesting to dive into the whys of them rejecting it, especially in conflict with the Dominion War and everything that's going on there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, without exploring it, they just kind of come off as like, get off your cell phone, make your own bread. You know,
you know.
But if you had explored that more, I love the idea of them being a race like the Federation or like humanity who discovered space travel, but didn't, you know, it didn't change them, and they didn't figure out all their problems, and they had to leave their planet because they destroyed it. And maybe they're still, this is an exile of sorts. Maybe they're still working things out. They're like somebody who went to, you know, anger management or something, and they're still trying to stay away from stressful situations, and maybe later they'll rejoin society. And then of course you've got the Sona who are like, no, we want to get back out there right now.
Well, the other thing about the Sona they don't address is that they're dying. Like they say at one point, like, oh, it would take them 10 years of natural exposure for some of them to reverse the effects of what they've done to themselves. And a lot of them won't live that long. And they never fully address that or go there, because that always stuck with me. I'm like, you know what? That really also explains a lot of Rafo's desperation in what he's doing, because without exploring that, he just comes across like a bit Saturday morning cartoon villain, like, you know, like let them die kind of thing. But there's this, he wants a better face. I really like where when they realize they've been transported to the holo ship and he sees it and he can't contact, he just lets out this scream. And it's just such an amazing pained scream. And I'm just like, that scene is so good. And I wish they maybe delved more into like the pain of like these people, you know?
Yeah. It's just the wail of a child.
Yeah, it is.
Like, yeah. I have to say that I really like the Sona as the bad guys. I think that they, everything that we've set up to this point, obviously. I also think that they look really awesome. You know, it's like this. They just really went for it with the makeup. It's just like Terry Gilliam-esque kind of thing that you don't usually see in
but
Star
not
Trek.
Too far. You know, like
not
it doesn't go into like
enough.
that. Yeah, not into that like parody element, but into that realistic. You can see somebody going that far to try and preserve. And there's like those scenes where his skin starts to split and like they're breaking apart, and like those scenes are great.
Yeah, they're these, you know, they're the Rumspringa kids, you know, who left the Amish, and now they've come back with a Four Loko and an Uzi, and they're like, stop churning butter. Listen, you don't understand. You're not my real young dad. And I think it's cool that they are very smart. You know, they're Baku, right? So they're really smart and advanced. and they chose to continue pursuing the technology. And so it's like a quick cheat to like, how do you keep coming up with races that can make the Enterprise go, oh boy, I don't know if we can take these guys. And so they've continued to follow like these technological lines. And so they've got these like cool ships. The designs of the ships are really neat and sort of threatening looking. And presumably, you know, they're, like you said, they're dying. There's probably very few Sona in the galaxy as well. So they can sort of claim that they're endangered, but still be victimizing the Baku. Although the film does not explore the fact that they have like client or slave races. Like it's just sort of thrown off that they basically have like, not all the Sona are original Baku Sona. They have people that they just forced to work for them.
They also ignore like their kind of the use of the illegal weapons, the fact that they're drug traffickers, just a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, they make drugs. Yeah, I do like that Troy's like, why are we talking to these people? Yeah. Jonathan Frakes directs this movie. He does a really great job, I think.
I do too.
I think that this is at least as well directed as First Contact, and I think that that's overlooked as this film is overlooked. Something that was a little overlooked is the effects. ILM, who had, of course, done effects for previous films, was not able to participate in this film. They were working on The Phantom Menace, the other Star franchise. So two other companies did. But this is the first Trek film in which all the ships that we see are rendered in CGI, and they don't use models. And I think most of them hold up pretty well. Maybe there's a couple sort of dodgy ship scenes. This is also the film with the most original sets in the franchise. 55 sets were built for the film, 18 more than First Contact. Although, as you said, several Voyager and DS9 sets were redressed for use in the film. And, of course, there's a ton of location shooting in this episode. You know, they shoot on the ground in First Contact for the Earth scenes, but they're all over the place. They built that village on Lake Sherwood in California, and the mountain scenes were shot in the Sierra Nevadas with locations that were accessible only by helicopter. So I'm sure that's a lot of where the budget went. I think it makes the movie look good. I think it comes off well. You know, there's definitely TNG episodes where, you know, they're in the mountains, or that great DS9 episode where Quark and Odo are climbing up the mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that it gives this movie a lot of character. I just don't know if like, I wonder if maybe Patrick Stewart was right and like the Alamo thing might have worked. It would definitely be more of an action thing.
It would have been more action based, but I have to say, I was rewatching this and my daughter wandered in about right at the point when they have to flee the village, and she was just mesmerized. Like she was absolutely hooked. And I was quite stunned by how into it she was. Cause I was kind of like, oh, like she might think it's a little boring. Like, I don't know. She's a little young to maybe, you know, be into it, but she was just hooked and she stayed with it the entire time. And just to see like the awe of it, you know, like how much awe it was giving her and like the space battle and everything. And then it flashed into my mind. I was watching her face contrasted with reviews of like, oh, needed better effects and needed this, needed that. And I was kind of like, I think it's fine, you know?
Yeah. As somebody with kids, like, have you noticed, do kids, I've always wondered, I don't have kids, do kids like watching kids or do they like watching adults?
It depends if the kid's annoying or not.
Okay. So even kids are like, oh, this kid, no.
No, like we were watching Sailor Moon and she turned to me and she was like, I like everybody except Sailor Moon. And I was like, why?
Oh, no.
And she was like, because she cries all the time. And it's annoying.
I can't be friends with your daughter. Well, explain to her when she's older that she has a long character arc. It takes 5 years. Well, actually 4 years because they repeat 1 year. But yeah, she becomes stronger as it goes on. That's interesting because I always, you know, I liked Luke Skywalker, who is a kid ostensibly, I suppose, a teenager. And then George Lucas is like, no, Anakin's got to be a little kid. And I'm like, little kids don't care about little kids. They like, you know, adults.
They like people who are cool or who they think are interesting. Like she didn't mind the little boy in the movie, but she wasn't as interested in him as she was in Data because he's like a machine. And so she was like, well, he's like a robot and stuff. Like that was way more interesting to her than, you know, a little kid.
Yeah, having little kids in your narrative, that's a TNG thing as well. I could go back and see how many of those TNG kid episodes Michael Piller was involved in. But usually when you see a kid on TNG, you're like, oh, we're in for a ride here.
This kid is pretty good.
He's okay. Yeah. And also it's definitely, let's give Brent Spiner something to do because he doesn't want to do this movie, period.
No, he didn't. He wanted to die. He wanted to be killed off.
That's right. Yeah. He got Rick Berman to promise that he'd kill him, and then when the final script came, Berman attached a note saying, "I'll kill you next time." Sorry about that. But it is interesting. I've never thought about that before. We've obviously had Data interact with children, but never really contemplate being a child and the fact that he has never been a child. Having the whole thing sort of wrap up with like, here's the lesson, have a little fun every day. It's like, okay, it's a little pat, but the movie's 103 minutes. What do you want?
It's interesting. It's just, I don't know if it's my favorite Data child interaction compared to when he ends up being looked up to as a parental figure or the like, but I think it works in this because the child starts off so afraid of him. And so I think it's a nice culmination of the idea that I think they were working towards at the end that's only touched on a reconciliation between like the idea that maybe they're not going to be quite so restrictive about hiding all of the technology, because you see the one Sona like reconciling with his mom. And that would have been, I think, really nice to touch upon too, because Anij is a good example of that, where when they first find the hidden under the water hollow ship, and the father is like, no, like, we don't need to go there and look at that. That's not our concern. And she's like, no, it's a concern to me. So I think that was an interesting contrast of that, the idea that some people there are just completely sticking their head in the sand. They don't want to know anything, but some people are still, they're more there for the lifestyle, but they're still interested in knowing about the stuff outside. And I thought
they've got a cell phone. They've got a cell phone. It's just in their locker. It's turned off. But
they check it once a day.
That's fascinating, that the idea that it isn't a blanket decision necessarily, that there are differing philosophies on what they're really doing. Because I wondered about the character of Artem, who doesn't, he's worried about the day of lightning, like he doesn't know anything about technology. And of course, his parents, who are original colonists, do. And so I wonder if they, as they have children, if they are trying to breed out the knowledge of technology as they go.
It feels like they are, and it feels like the Sonar are like, because of that, because of the rebellion that happened, that some people tried to leave.
That's interesting. If we saw, if there was, having the metaphasic radiation make them like invulnerable solves a lot of their problems. But it would be interesting in the film if we did see some sort of problem, some sort of like tension or detraction that the lack of technology causes. We could have saved somebody, or we could make even more grain if we use this. And they're like, no, we don't use this sort of thing.
I think it would be interesting to explore the idea that concept of, mindfulness, if taken to an extreme, can become stagnation.
Yeah.
Because they talk about like, oh, it's going to be 30 years and then he can become like an artisan. And I'm like, okay, that all sounds, like really nice. But on some level, some of this could come across like stagnation if you're not a person who just wants to kind of sit and quietly contemplate, and all of that kind of stuff.
Just be lotus eaters. Yeah. Interesting. But this 103 minutes, we don't have time for that. Let's talk about the guest stars in the film. We mentioned before the character of Artem, played by Michael Welch, who does a good job. F. Murray Abraham appears, of course, as Rufo. And Insurrection continues the grand Star Trek tradition of going out and getting a distinguished actor to play the film's villain. He is not British, but he is an Academy Award winner. And I read that he had said in interviews that he really enjoyed being in the movie. And if he had his choice, he would only do Star Trek movies for the rest of his career, which I thought was kind of funny. I love the idea that these incredibly accomplished actors, Shakespeare actors, Academy Award winners are like, oh, Star Trek, yes. Agent, get me that film. I want to do that film. He also really liked working with Patrick Stewart. Donna Murphy appears in the film as Anij. 80 actresses were auditioned for the role, but it was given to her. And I know that you have to audition for a role sometimes, but she won 2 Tony Awards. Like, I think that she's probably can handle the role of Anij, who was named Angie in early drafts. Some of the names are a little bit like sci-fi that up a little bit. Anthony Zerbe appears as Dougherty, who, of course, gives us Dougherty out, which he says like 50 times in the film. Clearly, that must have been a choice at some parties. Like, this is going to be how I sign off every time. And he had read for the role, the F. Murray Abraham role, but they gave him the other role instead. And I don't know a lot about him. I remember that he was Counselor, what's his name, in the Matrix movies, and he is in this. So he'd been in a couple big sci-fi things in the late 90s, but apparently he had an interesting audition style. He went in and instead of immediately reading the sides that he had or the part that he had to read, he recited passages from Dante's Inferno. He felt like that that was a good match for the character. And that's fun and all, but as somebody who's been on both sides of the auditioning table, I can just see people being like, okay, great, go ahead and read the thing now.
No, I know. I honestly, when I heard that, I was like, he's lucky that they liked it and that they still gave him something to do.
Yep. Great. Oh, he's wearing a costume. Oh, he's got a funny hat on. Oh, great. Don't bother recording this one. But yeah, everything turned out great. And he's great in the film. And what I like about him is he is sort of like the ultimate badmiral, bad admiral. We've had a long string of characters who, in the kind of trend that I was mentioning before, who represent like what's going on in the Federation. Like it's utopia, it's positive, but how is it maintained? And are there people in it who are making bad choices or bad choices for good reasons? And I like that is all concentrated in this guy with a huge belt buckle who says Dougherty out. And you don't feel too bad for him when he gets his face stretched off, but you do kind of understand what he thought he was doing. And when Picard, who immediately, is mortified by the idea of doing what he does, Picard reacts immediately. He takes the pips off and he gets to work. But if Picard had maybe just made a small concession and then a series of larger concessions, he could end up like Admiral Dougherty. And I think that makes him a lot more interesting as a villain.
What I liked about Dougherty too is that he really brought home this, like the distance in the Federation. Because lots of times you do lots of they're calling back to Earth and all of this stuff. But this really highlighted the fact that the Federation is so large. And at this point, they're stretched very thin. So when they're having their conversation, Dougherty and Picard, where he's talking about, like, of course I did this with Federation approval and all that stuff, you really get the sense of how distant the Federation Council is from what's actually going on out on the front lines. Because that's one of the core things. We're like, we need to get this information back to them so they can actually see what's going on. Because it really highlights that some of these things, like this is how institutions and situations break down. All of these just little breakdowns in communications, little things that people don't know that end up culminating in some really horrible things. Then they all come back being under the umbrella of the original Federation and Starfleet and institution. I found that really interesting to have that concentrated in this really small conflict, but you could see people rationalizing, because they rationalize it even while they're there right in front of them, like, oh, it's fine, it's only 600 people. So you can definitely see people even further away being like, oh wow, look at all these like great resources, the medicine, all of this stuff, like, yeah, of course, let's do it,
Yeah, it's that sort of frontier decision making where the captain or whoever it is like makes this decision as a representative of his government, But the admiral's getting ready to do a colonialism here on the Baku, and he's the one with the authority. And so it's like, even if I like how they say we have no idea how they vote for the president or how the government works in the Federation, but Rafu does say that there are Federation opinion polls. So apparently you can go on Twitter in the Federation and go, no, don't do a colonialism. Don't. But way out here in the middle of nowhere, specifically in this, sort of tortured region of space, like, Dougherty is the word of the law. Like he is the word of the Federation.
What I really like about that too is that it's like, especially with the refocus scene, is that it highlights that Dougherty knows it's wrong. Because in the other scenes, you can kind of frame like, oh, no, he thinks he's doing the right thing. But that scene is great in illustrating that, no, he knows it's wrong. And that's why they're hiding it. That's why they're being so cloak and dagger about it. That's why they have to do all of these things. And I think that that's a really good example of how you can present something as like, wrap it in the guise of like, oh, it's like for all of these things. But no, actually at the core, they know exactly what they're doing. Yeah.
I also like that they've eliminated the knee-jerk reaction of the Prime Directive applying, where you can just go, oh, we can't do it. It's the Prime Directive.
Well, I love when Anij calls Captain Picard out on it. She's like, oh, but your Prime Directive doesn't preclude spying.
Yeah, you can just spy on people. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah, but they're still, even without the Prime Directive, the principle behind it that Starfleet is supposed to protect the weak from oppression and not assist in it is still there. But now it's sort of softer, it's more fungible because there isn't this, grand rule. It's funny that everything we've been talking about, it's surprising that they wanted to eliminate the connections to Heart of Darkness when that's what comes out in the film.
Yeah.
Dougherty is Kurtz, essentially. He's just saying, look, we're doing, what's good for the people back home here by moving these people around on this planet. That still got through in the film.
It probably honestly got through better because they didn't hyper focus on it. I find when works try and hyper focus on Heart of Darkness that it doesn't tend to go too well unless you're Apocalypse Now. So
yeah, that's, I suppose. Yeah. It's funny too how, Trek always goes back to the literary allusion. I'm not saying don't, stop doing it. Like I think it's paid off well. Something that we talked about when we talked about First Contact is how First Contact takes the text of Moby Dick, something that is referred to very superficially in Wrath of Khan, and really personalizes, the connection and the illusion and the character of Ahab as overlaid on Picard. And then in a metatextual way, self-consciously has Picard go, oh my God, I'm being like this. I'm being like the guy that they talk about in Wrath of Khan. I'm being like Captain. I don't want to be Captain Ahab. Because he himself is well-read and familiar with it. And then the punchline is that Lily, the character who points it out, is like, I didn't read Moby Dick. I just, I've heard about it, but yeah.
I have to say one First Contact thing.
Yeah,
First Contact is the reason I can't wear contact lenses.
Because of
at the beginning,
eye trauma?
Yeah, at the beginning where you see the Locutus Oculus thing going through his eye, messed me up.
Oh, a new Star Trek film. Oh my God. Yeah, first minute. This movie is, I think, probably the funniest of the TNG films. I really do appreciate the humor. I've talked before on this show about how when Trek tries to do comedy, it's often kind of lame. But it's lame in an endearing way. And even though I hadn't seen this in a while, I found myself laughing out loud at some of the comedy bits.
The decision for beardless Riker always haunts me. I'm like, no, put it back on.
Yeah, it was a choice.
Like when Troy kisses him and she goes, yuck. I'm like, no, don't do it.
Put that beard back on. And the timing is good. Okay, these actors know these characters back to front at this point. And so just the timing of them, like when they're singing the Gilbert and Sullivan, and then they turn Data off and they turn him back on, and they're like, where were we? He starts singing again. They're like, no, not that. Like, what happened on the planet when you were there? I like that people doing plays and musicals all the time on the ship, which is a big feature of Pillars TNG, actually pays off here because it helps them nab Data. And the irony of them singing a song about British sailors in the Royal Navy, probably the most powerful force of colonialism in our history.
It's very apt. It's a very apt choice.
While they're getting ready to do a colonialism on the Baku. And then that song, A British Tar, is meant both in the show and by Gilbert, the lyricist, to be a satire of somebody who talks about fighting tyranny but is an agent of it. It's like, wow, good job, guys. Couple boxes checked there. What do you think about the rekindling of the Troy Riker romance?
I did. I could do without it, but I understand why it's there. Thematically and everything with their history together, I understand and appreciate it. It's just a personal choice for me that I'm like, it doesn't need to happen. But I think that especially for people who have been with the series for so long and have seen those characters dance around each other, and you have all of like the tie-in books like Imzadi and this idea that like they're just meant to be, I think it is nice to kind of see that culmination of like, it's finally, it's kind of finally happening. They're older, they're settling in to each other. So I think that it's nice in that regard, and I do appreciate it. I just do feel that parts are a bit jarring. I know they added that subplot in later as well as part of the lightning when they were going through the multiple script drafts.
Yeah.
But in terms of it working out, like they have good chemistry together and like they always have. So I feel like it works.
Yeah, it does. It does serve as kind of a payoff for people who did watch them sort of dance around each other. But I agree that, mature adults who are coworkers, like, don't have to get together. But I think at this point in the franchise, we're locked in. We are invested in them as a couple. I thought that the space fight, the ship fight, which is, of course, reminiscent of the ship fight in Wrath of Khan, was cool but unnecessary. Maybe we needed some side bit of action as they're evading the drones and the Baku or the Sona on the planet. But there's some great moments in it, but it does come off as sort of like, also we've got
we need an action scene. Like it does have very much like this is a space movie and it needs a space battle. So
yeah, it does, I suppose. And also we need to see the Enterprise E do something. Like it doesn't, it just gets invaded in the second movie. And then, of course, it does a lot in Nemesis, but we'll get there. I like the fact that we actually see like a successful warp core eject in this. It's like the ice cream machine at McDonald's. It's always broken, the ejection system, but we get to see it. And of course, we've got the manual steering column, which you can't fool me. I know
it's
that's
a joystick.
Logitech G Extreme 3D Pro joystick. I've got one on my desk right now. But it was somebody went, let's have some fun and do that.
I always laugh when it pops up because now it looks so retro. I'm like, it's the future. Get the joystick.
Right. Why don't you have holographic, Minority Report controls or something like that? Well, as we reach the end of the show here, was there anything that we have left unsaid? Any thoughts that you had about the film?
I would just say for people who are on the fence about it, I think give it a shot. Like, I feel like some people skip them or they've heard of like the odd number like Trek curse and like all of that kind of stuff. I think it's worth giving a shot, and I think it's worth, what I think is the most important thing going into it is to go into it as its own entity. Like not go into it as like, oh, this is Falling First Contact, or oh, this is supposed to be this, but just let it be Insurrection. And I find that that's the best way to approach it and the best way to enjoy it, because in many ways, despite the fact that it is so referencing the Dominion War a lot and it has all these payoffs from the series, in many other ways, it stands alone. So I think that, it deserves to be viewed as such.
That's a really interesting perspective. Let me take that in kind of the opposite direction for just a second. The TOS films, of course, had the Harve Bennett trilogy, 2, 3, and 4, where we sort of chart the course of these characters. Do you think that the TNG films needed or should have had a trilogy?
I feel that it works very well for TNG because the gap between the original series and the movies is so much bigger. And so it feels like you are building something so large, especially because of what they do with Spock and like the investment that fans have in Spock and Kirk's relationship is different than the relationship you have with the TNG crew and that series. I don't think anything in the new TNG movies ever achieves quite that level as when you see Spock die and then the search for him to come back. Like that's just such an emotional moment, especially if you are someone who's watched the original series. And one of the great things about the TNG ones is that they elevate so much of the original series. Like Space Seed is a good episode, but Wrath of Khan elevates it to a whole new level that it never has, like just by existing. So
that's interesting. Like if they had given, I'm starting to see patterns behind the development of some of the films in watching them all in for this series this year. And each TNG film has a clear inspiration, I think, within the TOS set of films.
And I think Insurrection, personally, I think it exceeds the film that it is inspired by. I don't personally think Voyage Home is
Star Trek
strong.
4?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Like 4, I feel is funny for the time, but is I find it painfully dated. Like to go back and the whales.
I can see that.
I can't.
Save the whales. Yeah. I wonder if we ever get a Star Trek 4 from the Kelvin films, they'll try to do a funny one.
Oh gosh, I'm not ready. If they do.
Yeah, have it be about carbon offset or something like that. Yeah.
I also feel like I know they're going for environmentalism themes with 4, but I feel like the technology themes, just because of where we are with technology becoming so ever present, we're entering the age of like, are we going to do a metaverse? Are we going to get chips in our hand? Like, all of those kind of things. I feel like the questions that are being asked in Insurrection are still so prominent in the idea of rejecting, because you're starting to see that now. You're seeing people making retreats, like turn off retreats, get off your phone. Like, it's becoming a growing movement for some people. So I think it's really still very relevant.
Yeah. If only it didn't take place in an odd numbered Star Trek film.
Yeah.
I read an anecdote from Michael Piller when he was at a test screening for the film, and as it ended, the audience was walking out, and he heard a guy say to his friend, well, what do you expect? It's an odd one. And he was like, 2 years of my life reduced to an odd number. But I definitely think we agree that it is more than just an odd numbered film. Well, Sasha, thanks so much for joining me on the show to talk about Star Trek and the universe of Star Trek. And if people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISDpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
They can find me at Casually Comics at my YouTube channel, and I have an email, which is casuallycomics.com, at gmail.com, and you can email me there too. So
awesome. Any new developments in the channel? Anything coming up that you want to tell us about?
I've got some fun retrospectives that I'm planning, some longer ones that have been long in the works, like nice. Finally my Namor and Sue video. So I'm very excited to finally get that done.
Yeah. What do you think about, they've cast a new Namor, right? He's going to be in the new Wakanda film.
They did. I'm always up for seeing what the person is like in the role. I don't know, because sometimes you think a person will be great or terrible, and you don't know until you see them in the role. And also you need to see how the movie is, because sometimes the person's great and the movie's terrible. So. Yeah.
I was really fascinated at the idea that, Namor is a big white guy with wings on his feet, and so tied to the idea of, the guy screams Latin when he attacks, he's tied to the idea of Roman,
Atlantis
white, and empire, and casting a Mexican actor and then sort of translating that to a Mesoamerican sort of empire thing is I thought that was really fascinating. So we'll have to see if he's good in the role, because that's what counts.
And I just hope they still keep all his beef with Wakanda and stuff, because Namor has beef with everybody, and I need to see it. So,
and I want to see him push up on Sue.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for joining me. We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
Bye.
Agent Ryan?
Agent the Vern?
The Rabbit Hole podcast team has asked us to return back to the town of Twin Peaks to go over all the case files. Are you ready?
Have we been asked to cover the case files of the groundbreaking series created by David Lynch and Mark Frost?
The same one. We will be discussing in detail every episode from all 3 seasons of the show,
including the plot of every character, not just the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer.
Exactly. We'll also dive into why the show became such a phenomenon in the 90s and how it still influences shows today.
Will we discuss the feature film Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me?
That may be our longest season yet.
So check Tales from the Double R on Anchor, Spotify, Good Pods, or listen to us at rabbitholepodcasts.com.
Now, let's order some coffee and a piece of that amazing pie.